a shadowy figure lurking in dark corners, waiting for children to be alone. A creature that hides under beds and in closets, ready to snatch away misbehaving kids when their parents aren't watching. You think you know the Boogeyman? A fictional monster parents use to scare children into good behavior? But what if I told you the Boogeyman was never fictional at all? What if I told you that every culture-esque version of this creature is based on real serial killers who terrorized communities for thousands of years? Because when you examine the folklore surrounding the Boogeyman across different cultures and time periods, you're not looking at mythology. You're looking at humanity's collective documentation of child predators, passed down through generations as a survival mechanism. And the most terrifying part, the FBI's modern behavioral profiles of child predators match Boogeyman descriptions with such perfect accuracy that it can't be coincidence. It's documentation. Welcome back, truth seekers. Before we expose this horrifying reality, let's examine what every culture tells us about the Boogeyman. He's a dark figure who preys specifically on children. He operates in shadows and hidden spaces, under beds, in closets, in the woods at night. He appears when adult supervision is absent. He uses fear and psychological manipulation to control his victims. He has specific hunting territories where he's most active. And most chilling of all, he becomes bolder if he's not confronted or stopped. These aren't the characteristics of a mythical creature. These are the exact behavioral patterns that FBI criminal profilers use to identify and track real child predators. Every single element of Boogeyman folklore matches what we know about how serial killers who target children actually operate. And when you research the historical origins of these stories, you discover something even more disturbing. They can be traced back to specific real killers, whose crimes were so horrific that they became embedded in cultural memory. Let's start with the American Boogeyman, and the real monster who inspired it. His name was Albert Fish, but newspapers called him the Gray Man. Between 1890 and 1930, Fish kidnapped, tortured, and murdered an unknown number of children across multiple states. He was a nondescript older man who appeared harmless and grandfatherly. Exactly how American Boogeyman stories describe the creature when he's not in his true form. Fish's hunting methods were identical to Boogeyman folklore. He targeted children who were alone or unsupervised. He used psychological manipulation, often telling children he was going to punish them for misbehavior, just like parents threatened the Boogeyman would do. He operated in specific geographic territories, returning to the same areas repeatedly. And he became progressively bolder over time, exactly as Boogeyman stories describe. When Fish was finally caught in 1934, police discovered that his crimes had spawned dozens of local legends across the regions where he operated. Parents in these communities had independently begun telling their children about a gray man who would take away children who wandered off alone. They thought they were creating cautionary fiction. They were actually documenting a real serial killer's hunting patterns. But Fish wasn't unique. Every culture has its version of the Boogeyman, because every culture has experienced child predators who operated using similar methods. In France, the origins of their Boogeyman stories can be traced directly to Gilles de Rais, a 15th century aristocrat who murdered over 100 children in his castle dungeons between 1420 and 1440. Court records from his trial describe methods and behaviors that match French Boogeyman folklore with terrifying precision. De Rais used his social position to gain access to children, promising them food, clothing, or employment. He lured them to his castle, where he tortured and killed them in underground chambers. His crimes created such trauma in the surrounding communities that stories of a noble monster who lived in a great house and stole children became embedded in local folklore. These stories evolved into the French version of the Boogeyman, but they began as literal documentation of real crimes. In Germany, Boogeyman stories can be traced to Peter Stumpp, serial killer from the 1580s who deliberately cultivated a supernatural persona to terrorize communities. Stumpp claimed to have werewolf powers and used this psychological warfare to make his crimes seem otherworldly rather than human. When he was finally caught and executed in 1589, his trial records describe a man who used exactly the tactics described in German Boogeyman folklore, hiding in forests, targeting children who ventured too far from safety, and using supernatural claims to increase fear and compliance. The pattern repeats across cultures and continents. In Eastern Europe, Stories of Baba Yaga can be traced to documented cases of women who murdered children during periods of social upheaval. In Latin America, El Coco legends originated during the colonial period when Spanish conquistadors and settlers routinely kidnapped and killed indigenous children. In Australia, bunyip stories emerged in areas where children frequently disappeared, always near waterways that served as actual disposal sites for real predators. What makes this evidence even more compelling is how modern FBI behavioral analysis confirms that these folklore patterns represent accurate predator psychology. The FBI's National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has identified core behavioral characteristics that appear in virtually all cases of child predators. And these characteristics match boogeyman descriptions across cultures with uncanny accuracy. Modern predators target isolated, vulnerable children, exactly as boogeyman stories describe. They operate in specific geographic comfort zones where they feel confident and knowledgeable about escape routes and hiding places. Just like the territorial behavior attributed to boogeymen, they use psychological manipulation, often positioning themselves as authority figures who have the right to punish or control children, identical to how boogeyman folklore describes the creature's interaction with victims. Perhaps most chilling of all, FBI profilers have identified that child predators become progressively bolder if their activities go undetected or unchallenged. Exactly as boogeyman stories warn. The folklore isn't just describing predator behavior. It's accurately predicting how that behavior will escalate if communities do and take action. But here's where the story becomes truly terrifying. In the United States alone, over 400,000 children are reported missing every year. When researchers map the geographic distribution of these disappearances, they find that missing children reports cluster in exactly the same types of locations described in traditional boogeyman folklore. Rural areas bordering urban centers, locations with limited adult supervision, areas with transient populations that make investigation difficult. The correlation isn't coincidental. Boogeyman folklore developed in these locations because these locations have always been hunting grounds for child predators. The stories didn't create the danger, they documented it. The danger never went away. Modern technology has allowed researchers to create heat maps showing where children disappear most frequently. And these maps reveal a disturbing truth. The highest risk areas for child disappearances correspond almost perfectly with regions that have the strongest boogeyman folklore traditions. Communities that have been telling boogeyman stories for generations are the same communities where children are still disappearing at the highest rates. This isn't because the stories are creating some kind of supernatural phenomenon. It's because the environmental and social factors that made these areas attractive to historical predators continued to make them attractive to modern ones. Remote locations with limited law enforcement presence, socioeconomically disadvantaged communities with fewer resources for child supervision and protection, geographic features that provide hiding places and escape routes. The FBI has identified that modern child predators are drawn to exactly these types of environments, and they use many of the same psychological tactics documented in historical cases. They target children during periods of minimal adult supervision. They use authority and fear to gain compliance. They exploit community denial and the tendency to dismiss threats as just stories rather than real dangers. In fact, FBI behavioral analysts have found that some modern predators deliberately exploit boogeyman mythology to their advantage. They understand that communities with strong folklore traditions are often more likely to dismiss real threats as imaginary ones. Parents who tell their children to fear a mythical boogeyman may be less vigilant about protecting them from the very real predators operating in their communities. The case files are full of predators who used this psychological camouflage. John Wayne Gacy deliberately cultivated a clown persona, exploiting the fact that clowns had become a modern version of boogeyman mythology. He understood that his victims and their families would be looking for a monster, not a friendly community member who performed at children's parties. The BTK killer operated for decades in communities where residents focused on stranger danger and imaginary threats, while ignoring the very real predator living among them. Modern online predators use similar tactics, presenting themselves as friendly authority figures while exploiting the same isolation and psychological manipulation techniques described in historical boogeyman cases. They understand that children who have been taught to fear obvious monsters may be less suspicious of predators who appear normal and trustworthy. The most disturbing aspect of this pattern is how it reveals the failure of modern child protection strategies. Instead of learning from the accurate predator documentation embedded in boogeyman folklore, our society has dismissed these stories as primitive superstition. We've focused on teaching children to fear imaginary monsters, while failing to educate them about the real behavioral patterns that actually indicate danger. Boogeyman folklore contains incredibly sophisticated predator awareness information that could save lives. If it were properly understood and applied, the stories accurately describe predator hunting patterns, victim selection criteria, psychological manipulation techniques, and escalation behaviors. They provide geographic awareness about high-risk environments and times. They even contain accurate information about community response patterns that either enable or prevent predator activity. But instead of using this information to protect children, we've treated it as entertainment. We've turned survival documentation into bedtime stories, stripping away the practical safety information and replacing it with generic moral lessons about obedience and fear. This transformation has had devastating consequences. Children who grow up hearing sanitized boogeyman stories often develop unrealistic expectations about what predators look like and how they behave. They expect monsters to be obviously monstrous, when real predators are typically ordinary-looking people who use charm and authority to gain access to victims. Parents who rely on boogeyman stories to teach safety often focus on stranger danger, while ignoring the statistical reality that children are far more likely to be victimized by someone they know and trust. The FBI estimates that over 90% of child sexual abuse is committed by family members, family friends, or authority figures within the child's community. Exactly the opposite of the stranger monster portrayed in modern boogeyman mythology. The real boogeyman was never a stranger lurking in shadows. The real boogeyman was the trusted adult who used their position to gain access to children. The real boogeyman was the community leader who everyone respected but no one suspected. The real boogeyman was the family member who everyone made excuses for because they could unbelieve someone so normal could be capable of such crimes. This is why boogeyman folklore from different cultures shows such remarkable consistency in describing predator psychology rather than physical appearance. The stories weren't trying to help people recognize monsters by how they looked. They were trying to help people recognize monsters by how they behaved. Modern FBI profiling has validated the accuracy of this approach. Behavioral indicators are far more reliable than physical appearance for identifying potential predators. The way someone approaches children, the types of relationships they seek to establish, the methods they use to isolate potential victims. These behavioral patterns are consistent across predator cases and match the warnings embedded in traditional boogeyman folklore. But recognizing these patterns requires understanding that the threat is real, ongoing, and much more common than most people want to believe. FBI statistics indicate that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will experience some form of sexual abuse before reaching adulthood. These aren't random victims of stranger predators. These are children being victimized by people their families know and trust, using methods that have remained consistent for thousands of years. The geographical clustering of missing children cases provides additional evidence that predator activity follows predictable patterns that communities can learn to recognize and address. High-risk areas aren't randomly distributed. They're located in places where predators can operate with minimal detection and maximum access to potential victims. Understanding these patterns could allow communities to implement targeted prevention strategies, improve law enforcement resource allocation, and educate families about realistic safety measures. But this requires acknowledging that the boogeyman represents a real and ongoing threat, not a mythical creature from humanity's primitive past. The most tragic aspect of our society's failure to understand boogeyman folklore is how it has allowed predators to continue using the same tactics that have been documented for thousands of years. Modern child predators aren't more sophisticated than their historical counterparts. They're using the same psychological manipulation, the same victim selection criteria, the same geographic preferences, and the same escalation patterns that have been described in folklore for millennia. The only thing that has changed is the tools available to predators and the technology they can use to identify and access victims. But the fundamental psychology remains identical to what communities documented in their boogeyman stories centuries ago. Today's predators use social media to identify isolated children, just as historical predators learned to recognize children who lacked adequate supervision. They use online grooming to establish psychological control before physical contact. Just as historical predators used psychological manipulation to gain compliance, they exploit the same vulnerabilities: economic desperation, family dysfunction, social isolation, that made children easy targets throughout history. The persistence of these patterns across time and culture proves that Boogeyman folklore represents accurate documentation of predator behavior. It's not primitive superstition. The stories have survived for thousands of years because they contain survival information that remains relevant and necessary for protecting children. But this survival information has been lost in the transformation of warning stories into entertainment. Modern parents tell Boogeyman stories to make children comply with bedtime routines, not to teach them how to recognize and avoid real predators. The practical safety information has been replaced with generic, fear-based compliance training that may actually make children more vulnerable to real threats. Real predator awareness requires understanding that threats come from ordinary-looking people using psychological manipulation, not obvious monsters using supernatural powers. It requires recognizing that predators target specific types of environments and victim characteristics, not random children in random locations. It requires understanding that communities play a crucial role in either enabling or preventing predator activity through their response to early warning signs. Most importantly, it requires acknowledging that the threat is real, ongoing, and present in every community. The Boogeyman never went away because the predators he represents never went away. They adapted to changing social conditions, adopted new technologies, and continued using the same fundamental tactics that have always worked for gaining access to and controlling child victims. The 400,000 children who disappear every year in the United States aren't victims of mythical creatures. They are victims of real predators using real methods that could be prevented. If communities understood and applied the predator awareness information embedded in their own folklore traditions, But if the Boogeyman represents the collective memory of real predators, there's one figure who stands above them all. One killer so prolific, so systematic in his methods, that his story became the template for every tale of a man who murders his wives. His name was Gilles de Rais, but history knows him by another name, Bluebeard. And the truth about what he did in his castle is far worse than any fairy tale could ever capture. How many wives did the real Bluebeard actually kill? What did investigators find when they finally entered his castle dungeons? And why do we still tell his story to children as a cautionary tale about curiosity, when the real lesson is far more terrifying? Click here to discover the truth behind history's most prolific serial killer and learn why his crimes are still inspiring copycat killers today.